Hello, everyone. So, this week we're going to be covering Book 2 of Paradise Lost, following up on everything we obviously saw in Book 1, leaving us at the site of Pandemonium, the Infernal Council. Before we begin, I just wanted to share a quote with you. This is from Northrop Frye's famous, really, introduction to literature called The Educated Imagination, written in the 1960s. So this is like what the copy looks like. You could probably find this somewhere on like a used book site or something for good quality and a cheap price. And I would highly recommend that, but I'm just going to say the quote real quick. Literature gives us an experience that stretches us vertically to the heights and depths of what the human mind can conceive, to what corresponds to the conceptions of heaven and hell in religion. So, what Milton is going to be doing here is teaching us about spiritual warfare. He's teaching us of the horrors of hell because he knows ending up there is something that we should not want. Yet, he is showing us that we are hellacious in our own right, as we will identify with the characters below, just as we identify with Satan. So, Paradise Lost is not written based on Milton's experiences, but based on his imagination. And, quoting Northrop Frye again, the way to develop the imagination is to read a good book or two. And Frye actually says that about Shakespeare's plays specifically, but I think he would agree that for Milton, the same thing applies, and that principle is really universal even across all of the great books as well. So just keeping that in mind, there is an educated imagination that comes from reading Milton and understanding really an educated theological imagination and how that ties in with what we're going to be reading every week, but that also includes what we're going to be reading here today, and just an educated imagination of hell itself. What does that actually mean? Well, maybe it's better for Milton to show us rather than for me to ramble on about that any further. So let's get into it. Okay, so just a reminder of our setting. We're in Pandemonium now. The Satan and the demons, they're not washed up, defeated on the lake of fire here, not on the shore of hell in a sense, but they are really truly going to be outside of that in a sense. They're going to be or inside of that. They're going to be in Pandemonium. Sorry, fixing my shirt. It's driving me crazy. So, we're at the Palace of Pandemonium. The Infernal Council is about to commence. Just a quick reminder of what Pandemonium actually means. So, taking some Greek words here, Pan means all, Daimon, or Daimonia, means celestial, in this case, demon, a fallen angel, and Eon is a place of worship. So Pandemonium, we put that all together and it just means Pandemonium is the place of worship for all the demons. So Book 1, line 797 uses the word frequent when describing this setting. And this is coming from the Latin adjective frequens, which just means full or crowded. So it's describing that Pandemonium, the Infernal Council, though there's only going to be 5 speakers, including Satan, this is a full house. It's a packed house. It's Super Bowl Sunday, right? Like it's a game of the World Series, right? It's Game 7 of the NBA Finals. Like this is a packed house. This place it's riotous. It's going to be filled with people who are passionate, and there's going to be speakers speaking to them. Maybe even like it could be in a political sense today, where there is a packed house at a rally of some sort. So if heaven is the dwelling place of all the angels, and it is a place of worship, which it is, then Pandemonium really serves as the anti-heaven, and that is exactly what it is in Milton's poem. So let's get to the speeches now really quick, and just an overview of the speeches before we actually talk about the speakers and what they say. So I'm going to be referencing Lewis's preface to Paradise Lost quite a bit. I'll hold it up once again. There's probably other editions out here, but this is the one I always see. And he has an entire chapter. Chapter 14 of this is just dedicated to talking about Satan's followers. Specifically, he's talking about Book 2. The majority of Book 2 is this scene of these speeches, and that's what this chapter is about. So great resource right there, where we get a chapter of Lewis's book that is exactly about what we're talking about here. So C.S. Lewis reminds us that though Paradise Lost is not an allegory, the moral significance of these situations appear as such because, begin quote, he is describing the very root from which these human situations grow. So Milton's demons do not have an opportunity to repent, and Lewis credits Milton for never raising that question of what if they did repent? Because they can't. The gates of hell are locked from the inside, that idea being in this chapter and also being quoted in The Great Divorce as well. There being parallels there that we could get into another time. So this chapter starts off with Satan's opening statement here. Basically, Satan's, he's deceiving them as he always is. Satan's really never telling the truth, but what he's saying sounds really, really sweet to the ears of those who are listening to him. That's a reoccurring theme we're going to see from basically his followers to sin and death, the characters at the end of this book, into Adam and Eve. He really knows how to draw people in and to manipulate them with things that he knows that they desperately desire above all things. And so he's lying to his followers here and telling them that the fall was the best thing could have happened to them. He's saying, don't worry about it in a sense. It's better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. This is good. We've fallen. We're finally away from that terrible tyrant God, and we can move on now. We can do our own thing. But the core question is about this, and I think this is what Milton's drawing us into here, is what do you do after you have fallen from heaven? What is the best way to respond to this loss of paradise, in a sense? Loss of paradise being different than what Adam and Eve are eventually going to lose. And the Sunday school answer here, as it applies to us as humans, is Jesus, the gospel message. It's worth noting that often the Sunday school answer, if the Sunday school itself was good, that the Sunday school answer is often actually the right answer. It just needs to be fleshed out more for adults and whatever the appropriate intellectual level is of the questioner or the listener here. But the right answer is Jesus. The right answer is the gospel, the crusher of the head of the serpent, the snake crusher, I've heard him even referred to as some authors. The author of the children's story Bible I read my kids, of course. But we're going to get 4 speakers here that are going to respond to this question. And unsurprisingly, they're all completely wrong. They don't see Jesus or the Son of God or God really in any way in the answer, but really they're going to be directly and vehemently opposed to God. So let's start with Moloch here. He's going to be our first speaker. What does Moloch mean? What is that name? Well, from what I know, and that isn't much as I'm not an Old Testament or Hebrew scholar, but what I do know is that Moloch is often associated with child sacrifice. And in the Middle Ages, he's often depicted as this bull-headed figure, kind of looks like a minotaur. Minotaur is used in classical mythology, also used in Dante in the Middle Ages, but really the question is Moloch representative of some kind of sacrifice involving the sacrifice that is entailed by waging warfare on heaven? Worth thinking about because Milton's always using these names for certain reasons with characters, and I think that's what Lewis was getting at in this chapter. So, what's Moloch's approach here? Well, line 51, he says, open war. And in line 61, after he further describes open war, he gets to armed with flames and fury. We can really summarize Moloch's approach with this. What can be worse than to dwell here, driven out from bliss, condemned in this abhorred deep to utter woe, where pain of unextinguishable fire must exercise us without hope of end? It's lines 84 to 89. Let's hone in on that word fury here, because Lewis is going to be talking about this in his chapter on Satan's followers. And Lewis has this to say of fury. But is fury safe? That does not matter. Nothing can be worse than the present. To rush blind-headed at the thing we have wronged. Do tie hitting it, this would be the best that could happen to us. And who knows, we may hurt it before we die. This is Lewis summing up Moloch's approach. Direct warfare, assault, channeling that fury, that rage into another attempt, another go at battling the celestial armies of heaven. So, my question for you, and I'm leaving this for the discussions on Wednesday night this week, the class, but why does Moloch think this would work if it failed the first time? Does he actually believe there can be a different result? Or is Moloch really just saying, well, we might as well die trying, right? Try to siege heaven, conquer heaven, or die trying. I'd rather fail and die than just sit here and do nothing. Is that his approach? Worth thinking about as you go through this. Alright, so moving on to our next speaker, Belial. What does Belial mean? Well, the term Belial is often used to characterize people who are wicked or worthless. They're lacking in worth. They're lacking in value for some reason. St. Paul describes Belial as, or uses the term Belial to describe people that are causing dissension and are being problematic in the Church of Corinth in the first century. And in 2 Corinthians 6:15, he says, "And what concord hath Christ to do with Belial?" Here it is likely that he means lawless men, sons of pestilence, wicked people in the Church of Corinth in that context. And so Belial is the ruler of, or Belias is the ruler of the underworld in some forms of ancient Gnosticism. It's probably not where Milton is drawing from. It's possible, but likely if it's used in the Bible, that's probably the main source that he's getting to here. But nevertheless, Belial's approach can really be summarized as, is this then worse? So Belial is really trying to say, ignoble ease, peaceful sloth, and maybe we'll just get used to it. Belial is suggesting that it's not good to do what Moloch is suggesting. They're just going to fail again. What if we just wait it out and the suffering eventually eases? What if God just doesn't, God, maybe he won't forget about us, but what if God just decides to ease our suffering, to ease the fires of hell and the misery down here? Now, is it right for Belial to suggest that they do not further offend God and lose their existence by doing so? That's what he's worried about. Why die? He's taking kind of the opposite approach of Moloch. Why die when we know we're going to lose? There's a better chance that we're just going to, if we just wait it out here, things will get better. That's a far better approach in Belial's opinion. They know they can't win, and maybe he's right. They can't win, right? Like there's some truth to that, but is there a better approach? What's Mammon gonna have to say in contrast to these two speeches? So moving on to Mammon, what does Mammon mean? Well, in Hebrew, the word Mammon just translate to what in English we would call money, or sometimes even just wealth. So money just being currency, but wealth being the possession of a lot of currency, a lot of economic resources, if you may. Jesus says in the Gospel of Luke that you cannot serve both God and Mammon. He's contrasting, greed, hoarding of wealth, maybe even squandering of wealth in some senses, with being a Christian, with serving God. Interestingly enough, St. John Chrysostom, famous preacher of the patristic era, so end of the 4th century, basically 4th century AD, after the first two ecumenical councils. And St. John Chrysostom is going to personify Mammon as greed, and saying that the greedy are those who serve Mammon and slavishly obey it. That's in his homilies on the book of Colossians, and I think that's a great summary here. He's associating it with greed, and it's not having money, it's being a servant of money. You know, the love of money being the root of all evil. I think Chrysostom is in line with that here. And one more reference here, but in The Fairy Queen, Spenser portrays Mammon as a creature that's overseeing a cave that's filled with treasure. It's filled with worldly possessions, right? Worldly wealth. So there's absolutely connotations with greed or avarice here, in a sense. And that's Milton's doing something with that here, right? What are the connotations of greed here? Well, those are things worth thinking about as you read through this. I'm not going to answer that at the moment. Interestingly enough, there's ties here with Martin Luther's larger catechism. In his catechism, he goes through his explanation of the Ten Commandments, and as he's explaining the first commandment, he has this to say: "For very few are to be found who are of good cheer, and who neither mourn nor complain if they have not mammon." So Luther is really talking about the first commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." Luther's really getting at idolatry here, and that money, wealth, mammon often is an idol for people, that people that don't have wealth obsess over wealth rather than being content with what God has given them. Or those who have wealth, they often just forget to be generous with it, forget to use it and steward it well. So Luther attributes having a God before God as: to have a God is to have something in which the heart entirely entrusts. Things worth keeping in mind as we read and study Mammon here. But his approach, what is his approach? Well, in line 272, Mammon has this to say: "Nor want we skill or art from whence to raise magnificence, and what can heaven show more?" In a sense, he's saying to seek freedom and liberation, to seek our own good from ourselves, and build an empire in hell. He's saying that we can make hell, or that they can make hell as good as heaven. He is possibly the most bought into Satan's philosophy of, once again, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. Those famous lines of Book 1, and I can't, off my memory, remember some of the other things he says about, the power of the mind to really make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. That's kind of a paraphrase. I don't think that's an exact quote, but really, that's really what Mammon's approach is here. He's trying to say that they can just make heaven here. They can just make themselves a heaven. They don't need God to do so. And here's what C.S. Lewis has to say about this: "Heaven was magnificent. If hell is made equally magnificent, it must be just as good. There was light in heaven. If we produce artificial light, it will be just as good. There was darkness in heaven. Why then should we dislike the darkness in hell?" So C.S. Lewis is basically just summarizing it here. We can just make the things of heaven in hell. Why wouldn't they be the same? Why can't we just make them? Why wouldn't the quality be there? I think Milton's asking us these questions as readers. And producing this artificial light, as C.S. Lewis is pointing out, in a sense, this is like the demons of Milton's hell being trapped in Plato's cave. The true light, God from God, true light from true light, God from God, light from light. Those are the words I'm looking for, the Nicene Creed. I have a sign right behind me on this wall that I had to reference there. But the true light and the substance of truth, goodness, and beauty exist in God, and these things flow out of God in the created order. And hell is only filled with privations of these. They're just filled with these phony baloney imposters of goodness, truth, and beauty. And what Mammon doesn't understand is that that's all he's going to get by trying to make a heaven of hell. He's going to get just these phony baloney images, the shadows of these images just plastered against the wall of the cave that are illuminated by the fire, but The real thing, the sunlight, the actual images themselves, the creatures that live outside of the cave, he can't have those because he's in hell and they don't exist here. This is the worst place. It's horrible. And they're trying to make something beautiful out of something horrible. And they just can't, no matter how hard they try. And we'll see that later on, certainly. Funny enough, we read this, and Mammon's speech was really winning out here. He's winning out until Beelzebub comes in and intervenes with an alternative plan. I want to pause right there and propose another question for our discussion this week. What would have happened if this speech had won out? How would the story of Paradise Lost look different? What would happen? Would things change? How dramatically would they change? Because the answer is obviously yes, they would change if this is what the demons happened. And would Adam and Eve have ever fallen if they went with Mammon's approach? Maybe they go with Mammon's approach and eventually get tired of it, and then they just go with Beelzebub's approach anyway, right? Worth considering. Now for Beelzebub and his approach. Beelzebub's approach is to disturb God's plans by seeing what he's doing in the cosmos now. C.S. Lewis comments on this saying, "They cannot at all escape from hell, nor in any way injure their enemy, but that there is a chance of injuring someone else." So he's ultimately arguing for something different than what he finally agrees with Satan on. But Satan, being the skilled tyrant leader that he is, pretends like he actually cares about the input of his thought and followers. But in all reality, he's just going to manipulate and do what he wants to do anyway. And of course, we'll see him paint himself as the hero of this entire story, as a tyrant and a charismatic leader will often do. He's a narcissist. Satan's self-absorbed. He always is going to spin things so that he looks the best amongst everybody else, and that somebody who's actually as great looks terrible, aka God. He's projecting his own tyranny onto God time and time again. So Beelzebub suggests that they disturb humanity, ultimately, what they find out as God is created, and what Satan is going to be the only one to actually see in this story. But this all basically this entire council culminates in what Beelzebub says here. And we see in Milton what Alexander Pope praised of Homer regarding Homer's battles in Pope's preface to the Iliad of Homer, which was written, I think it was published in 1720. It was written throughout the 17 teens as he was working on his English translation of the Iliad. But he says this of Homer: "Every battle rises above the last in greatness, horror, and confusion." Now, end quote there, by the way, but though this is no battle, the same pattern really follows throughout this 4 speeches, and Beelzebub wins out. So, in class, another thing I really want to discuss is that we talk about these approaches and talk about really which one actually would have been the best approach, or just kind of parse out really what are the good and bad ways that these are approached, and maybe even as if you have a favorite character for some specific reason, things I want to get into in class, but won't take up more time on here. So this ultimately culminates in them agreeing with this plan, and Satan is volunteering to go. So is Satan actually heroic here? Does he actually display a true sense of the cardinal virtue of courage, or fortitude as it's sometimes called here? He's telling them that they're going to stay here and find a way to endure hell, and he's going to go on this journey and save them all from hell. So this is really Satan's kind of get out of jail free card for a little while here. But is he heroic in doing this? And why does he want to go alone, right? Is it solely just for his own narcissistic purposes? Or does he actually think that he has the cunning to disrupt whatever's going on in Eden? And does he think that bringing others would actually be a detriment to his plan? Does he actually think others could ruin his plan or foil it because they're not as cunning as he is? And he's right in a sense, they're not. But what's going on there? Are those his reasons for wanting to be alone? Again, things worth considering. Okay. So, let's see, where am I at here? All right, yep, so Satan's volunteering to go. And really there's this disturbing response that we see from the demons where they're worshiping Satan like a god. But I think this is what he wants, right? It culminates in everything we just talked about. This is what Satan wants. We're going to see later on that Satan's rebellion is ultimately stirred up by his envy for, you know, Christ, the Son of God, the Logos, him being the King of Kings instead of Satan. Satan cannot accept with humility his place in the cosmos as God has ordered him. And so Satan propping himself up as the hero is really his twisted way of trying to mimic what Christ has in heaven, where the angels bow down to him as the King of Kings. Now the demons bow down to Satan as the King of Kings. He is antichrist, truly, and that is the imagery that we are getting here. And so there's going to be some demonic activity too after Satan leaves, and this is really interesting. I hope we can talk about this more in class, but what is the way that the demons are responding? What do their responses tell us about them, and what does Milton tell us about human hedonism in this sense, humanistic hedonism? So we really have the three groups here. We have like the martial artists, not don't think of people doing like karate or anything like that, but people who are into valor, who are fighting with spears, melee weapons, such thing. People who are obsessed with warfare. This kind of reminds me of a fallen version of the Hrossa. The Hrossa are the martial creatures who are the warriors and the poets in on Malacandra in C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet. So they really kind of take up the warriors and the poets at the same time. And but there's an entire camp here that are devoted to music and poetry. But how does their poetry, how does the poetry here in Hell differ from the poetry of Paradise Lost, right? Like, how is this different? And Milton is a poet, so he clearly values poetry, but why does he sort of cast poetry and music as these hedonistic things here? Like, what's he doing with that? In the third camp, and this camp is really the fallen version of Lewis's Sorns on Malacandra, there's a camp of philosophical speculation here. Perhaps Milton is just suggesting to us that there is good and bad philosophical speculation, and that what they're doing here is just nonsensical. All things to discuss. There's a lot that could be said about that, but I'm going to just leave them there for now as things to ponder as you're preparing for class or reading or even rereading book 2. All right, so we're going to make a hard shift completely away from Pandemonium now, and we're going to get to the gates of hell themselves and the characters of sin and death. So let's start with sin. So we have some imagery here, and notice that sin has the keys to the gates of hell, just as in some theological traditions, and even we see in Matthew with Jesus giving Peter the keys of the kingdom. What do we see? We kind of see sin here as like an anti-Peter, right? Like, she's holding the keys of hell here. She possesses them. She has that ability to say when the gates open and who gets in and who gets out. So, first of all, what did Milton think about Peter having the keys to the kingdom of heaven? That could be an interesting theological thought there, just as Milton was clearly, really anti-papist. So he's not doing, I doubt he's really suggesting Peter as being the first pope and there being a Roman Catholic apostolic succession here. He's clearly very against that. But he saw some connection here, and I think that's worth pondering and exploring. But the imagery of the character Sin it's horrific and it's grotesque, really, beyond this. Sin's being eaten up from the inside as she is growing pregnant with the character Death. I'm sure this is intentionally grotesque and horrific. I think Milton's trying to show us something there about just the nature of hell, but also the nature of sin itself and how that affects us as fallen humans, as we are fallen now after the events of Genesis 1-3. And as for the character Death, so Death was born out of the head of his father, just like Athena was born out of her father Zeus's head in classical mythology. Remember, there's a perversion sense here. Milton's drawing on classical mythology to show a form of satanic perversion rather than describing classical mythos as it pertains to God or heavenly things, right? Milton's going to be very careful to do that. He's not going to take it in directions that Dante took it. And so we have these just grotesque images of these characters, and we're gonna see more of them later on. But what's Satan doing here, right? Like, how is Satan going to get out of hell? How is he going to get the gates open? He doesn't have the keys. Sin has the keys. Well, Satan's going to promise sin of a brighter future. Even in hell, this, dark, twisted place, Satan can make things seem so right. He can make them seem well. Because Satan is a tyrant, and he's making the subjects that he has under him see hell as a heaven. And this whole idea, this whole approach that Satan has is really hellacious in its own right. He's totally distorting and twisting everything, kind of flipping it to its opposite end. Again, as we see in his ideologies explained in Book 1, they're going to play out in Book 2 and Book 3, and so on and so forth. Truly a motif throughout the poem. Sin and death here, they're starving. They're famished, right? So Satan promises them food, right? And they're unable to use reason properly to choose the good over the appetites. As Jesus, the true man with a chest here in Paradise Regained, who his appetites are totally subjected and governed by his reason. Satan is when tempted with food by Satan in Matthew 4 and in the events of Paradise Regained, he is not even considering giving into that temptation. But sin and death, they're promised these things. They're promised things, and they're flattered by Satan, especially sin, and they're ultimately going to give over the keys to the gates of hell. They're going to give access out of hell for Satan. Now, these bring up a whole other dimension of questions. Like, where does God fit in with this, right? Isn't God omnipotent? He's powerful over all things. Isn't God omniscient? He knows everything, right? He's powerful over all things, and he's good. He claims to be good. But God is allowing Satan to get out of hell. He allows Satan to live, and why is he doing this? And in fact, when we see Satan getting out of hell and he's saved by this gust of wind, it seems like God is actively willing to save him. So why is he doing that? Is God somehow the author of the fall of man? Is God going to continue to actively ordain things so that Satan wins out against humanity? And just a remembering as you're pondering these questions, Milton is radically opposed to anything deterministic. Anything that comes off as deterministic to him, even if it's actually not, Milton is going to be really opposed to this. He's very concerned that it would make God as a tyrant. He doesn't believe God is a tyrant, so therefore he's going to emphasize views of free will much more. But here he's doing something here, right? And in contrast to this throughout the poem, we're going to see, and we especially see this as Satan is going to Eden and actually working against Adam and Eve in Eden, trying to seduce Eve to eat the fruit. We see God's permissive will here rather than some sort of active determinative will. So in his permissive will, God is not actively making something happen by totally possessing the will of another being and directly controlling them, but rather he's not actively stopping Satan either. So this is really what Milton's view of the relationship between God and Satan is. It's kind of like when you read Job chapter 1 and Job really being like the biblical epic as is seen by many critics throughout the Western tradition. Satan and God are having this dialogue in Job, and God, he has to allow Satan to do these things, right? He's almost like a dog on a leash, right? He's not this powerful guy that God is struggling with. No, Satan's almost like a joke to God in a way. It's almost like, look at that pesky Satan over there just doing his thing. But God knows what Satan's doing, right? He's not just trying to guess. And so just remember, that's a key here. He's not fooled. He's not lacking in power or goodness or anything, but he's providing really Adam and Eve with the ultimate test here. Because remember, Obedience is a motif for Milton. Milton believed that God is not a tyrant, and that since God is not a tyrant, he had to endow Adam and Eve with the free will to choose to obey him, and freely choose to not buy into Satan's enticements about partaking of the fruit and becoming like gods in their heavenly paradisal knowledge themselves, right? That's what he's doing here. So for Milton, God still has omniscience. He has foreknowledge. He knows what's coming down the pipe. But he also has omnipotence and the power to do anything. But he doesn't do everything to stop Satan. He doesn't do everything to save Adam and Eve. And he has reasons for that, being the free will to choose obedience or disobedience themselves. God is never surprised or fooled. He always knows what's going on, and nothing in the cosmos happens because he is weak in any way or has failed in any way. It's all perfectly ordered, and where it is not perfectly ordered, God is still sovereign over these perversions that Satan and his followers have caused. So no, it does not mean that God is actively ordained at all. That's not what Milton's saying. Some might even argue that he has. There's theodicies out there that will deal with that, but we're not going to get into that. If you want to talk about it in the discussions, please feel free to do so. Alright, so let's just talk about some final imagery here real quick. So we have this imagery of a golden chain, and really the classical mythos, the classical philosophy. The golden chain basically kind of symbolizes and illustrates that there's this natural connection to the heavens and earth. Another image we have here is one of an antipath. So the path from hell to Eden exists by the will of God. And again, what is the purpose of this? We kind of answered that before, but it's worth talking about further because it's likely very much bound up in God's permissive will for Milton. Notice, though, that the path from heaven to earth is wide open, and we'll see that in the later books, but the path from hell to earth is locked shut. So this shows that there is a freedom in obedience to God and a type of bondage to disobedience. It also really just shows us that earth is a battleground for spiritual warfare. Even before the fall, there's a sense where that exists, where God allows Satan to leave the locked gates of hell, and the angels, Michael, Raphael, others, as God sends them, can freely move from heaven to Eden. There's really an open pathway. It's not locked in a sense. Okay, so that's really all I have for this week. I think there's just many good questions in here that I really want to probe into during our discussion on Wednesday night. I hope this video has been helpful for really giving you some ideas for book 2. So many things to ponder here, so many things to think about. But again, I hope this video is helpful for you, and I really look forward to our discussion on Wednesday night. Thank you, and God bless.